when we're evaluating the movement here or anywhere. It's really what happens in the struggle from below that determines everything. We could look at Iraq today and know that if there was not resistance, if imperialism had gotten their way, then today the U.S. would be involved in a war in Iran, Syria, North Korea. They would go on and on and on. So it's the very fact that they've met enormous resistance that they can't put down that becomes decisive. I think everyone here has seen it. There was a demonstration where Time magazine, the AP, said 500,000. Many of the figures are actually much larger. A demonstration in Belgrade. And then it had very militant groups that broke off and did other creative actions, such as trashing the U.S. Embassy in Belgrade. Of course, right away, every arm of the U.S. State Department, everybody else jumped on Serbia and demanded an apology, a denunciation, expressed their shock, their horror. But this is the first real sign of resistance coming from below since the collapse of the Soviet Union, since 1991. If we want to think about what's happening, where there has just been a steamroll across all the republics of the Soviet Union and all of Eastern Europe and the Balkans, and corporate power just seizing, gobbling up, privatizing, rolling back every gain that had been made in 70 years and in 50 years' time. So finally, here is, and we don't know how far it will go, what it means. We should take note it was not only the U.S. Embassy that was hit. There was about 70 Western, like franchise stores. There were 10 McDonald's that were trashed and a Nike store. And some Western banks that had their windows broken and so on and so forth. There were 2 border posts, one set on fire, one that was exploded. This is important what's happening. There were further clashes. There was a mass effort to cross a border into Kosovo that was pushed back, and these are Serbian residents of Kosovo who have every right to return. They have every right. All of this is supposedly in response to the U.S. recognition of the independence of Kosovo. This is supposedly a move that came from the Albanian Kosovo population after waiting so many years and years. This is the way it's presented in the press. In the first days after every warning was given to U.S. imperialism not to take this step, they went ahead and all the coverage was of supposedly cheering throngs in Pristina. The most important thing I think we have to know here is that this is not anything to do with independence for Kosovo. Kosovo, the size of Connecticut, it really is much more like Commonwealth and the colonial status of Puerto Rico. What is being set up for Kosovo, what used to be a colonial viceroy, or what L. Paul Bremer, his position in Iraq, where absolute authority is vested in a NATO and European Union appointee who has the power, the authority to overrule any rule, any directive, any legislation, who has the power to decide who can run for office and who cannot, and who has decisive control over the treasury, taxation, all finances, foreign policy, domestic policy, loans, police, and military. I don't think garbage collection was in there. So that's about what the... That's right. So this is not independence that has been granted to Kosovo. There is an appointed government and one appointed official, and then the EU gets to set up a structure called the European Security and Defense Policy Mission, and they're sending some 2,000 administrators. NATO also sets up an international military procedure. Both of these bodies also, along with the administrator, can each individually or together overrule any of the decisions. And all of them have access to any document, any person, any piece of equipment, anywhere in Kosovo. This is all part of the Kosovo Independence Agreement. This is not even limited self-rule. The other point, which is being very, very strongly raised, and we should just take note, I want to go into how strongly raised, but by a number of countries, that this is a violation of international law. What does it confirm for us? It's no surprise to anyone here. The U.S. record is to violate every treaty, every international law, every agreement they've ever made with any country. And that started with the wars against the native peoples. Every treaty ever signed with the indigenous population of this country has been broken. On the case of Kosovo, the U.S. actually dictated the terms of the ceasefire agreement. It was passed then as a UN Security Council resolution. Even that agreement guaranteed that Kosovo it's a province of Serbia, and that the sovereignty of Serbia would be respected, even though NATO U.S. tanks rolled in and seized hold of Kosovo. But they said, well, we're just here temporarily to stabilize the situation. We recognize that Kosovo is part of Serbia. In violation of the very agreement that they themselves wrote and agreed to, they have recognized Kosovo's independence. It just means that it's a complete break even of international law. It's also important to recognize that there's absolutely no benefit for the population of Kosovo in this so-called independence. Not only the Serbian population, but the Albanian population, who is the majority population of Kosovo today. And that's after hundreds of thousands of Serbs were under NATO occupation, pushed out. More than 250 to 300,000 Roma, Jewish, Serbian, and many, many people of mixed background and heritage were expelled from Kosovo, from this small area. But how about for the people who remained? Unemployment today in Kosovo is 60%. It is a center for the drug trade in Europe today and for the sex trade in terms of prostitution. And that is because there are big U.S. bases there. There are not only thousands of U.S. soldiers and thousands of contractors and then thousands of UN agencies, personnel there. EU, as I said, another 2,000 going on. And all of that also generates an enormous level of corruption of people under occupation. More than 25% of the Albanian population has been forced to immigrate, many to Europe and to the U.S., and they send home remittances in order for their own families to eat, along with all the Serbs who've been expelled. So this independence or U.S. occupation hasn't benefited the population of Kosovo. At one time, the Yugoslav Federation was a federation of 6 republics, 25 million people, and it had achieved within about a 45-year span, it went from being the poorest corner of Europe, the most underdeveloped, the most impoverished, to a country with complete literacy, health care for all, a high level of industrialization and internal trade, until the U.S. forcibly broke up this federation and recognized republic by republic, supposedly independence, sovereignty for each of these separate little republics. By sanctions, and IMF and World Bank economic measures completely bankrupted the federal government. Just said you will have no more credits, no more trade, no more loans. And this was really the basis of the wars in 1991. Fracturing the area into smaller and smaller states, and then taking these industries that were nationalized and privatizing them forcibly. Serbia was the one republic that really tried to resist and has forcibly had their industries, especially in Kosovo, privatized. I was in Yugoslavia during the 1999 NATO bombing. We had an International Action Center delegation that went there during the war. It's important because today, when the U.S. expresses its horror, its outrage that its embassy was bombed, to remember that for 78 days, the U.S. bombed what's today called Serbia, but that was at that time Yugoslavia, the Yugoslav Federation, the remains of it, and especially Kosovo. More than 35,000 cluster bombs. We visited hospital after hospital where there were people who'd had multiple amputations because they'd been hit by cluster bombs. 15-year-old girl, I remember, who had lost both her legs. She had still 25 pieces of shrapnel in her back and on her spine. And the cluster bombs were everywhere. We saw marketplaces that had been hit by cluster bombs, bridges literally, in front of us, gas stations and heating plants, and the industry of Belgrade was just a smoking ruin with very toxic fumes everywhere. The stench filled the air, the electrical grid, communications destroyed. 480 schools were bombed. 480 schools. At the end of the war, the U.S. admitted that they had been able to destroy 14 tanks, but they'd hit 480 schools. The level, when they make war on a civilian population, during that time there was enormous resistance. People would come out day after day, even into places that were targets, and stand there, put huge bullseye, and dare NATO to bomb. They would stand on the bridges. It was just an amazing mood of combativeness.